So this is a short introduction to Plato's theory of forms. The first thing to recognize is that Plato's theory of forms, along with Aristotle's theories, were meant to solve the two problems that we had talked about earlier in the semester. We had said that Socrates invented philosophy by seeing that perhaps objectivity was the solution to both of these problems. The first problem is what we're calling the ethical problem, or the problem of happiness, which is how human beings can be happy in a life where everything is temporary and can be taken away from them. And then the second problem was the problem of reconciling Heraclitus and Parmenides, of figuring out how the world can appear to be both permanent and changing at the same time. And this was also called the problem of the one and the many, since from the objective point of view it seemed to Parmenides that the world must be one, whereas from the subjective point of view it seemed to Heraclitus that the world must be an irreducible manyness or multiplicity. So the second problem Plato's theory of forms is meant to solve, as we said before, is to dialectically synthesize Heraclitus and Parmenides and explain how reality can be both permanent and changing. And Plato's solution is a pretty simple one. It's called dualism. The simplest way of reconciling two different points of view is to suggest that they're both true, and to split reality into two different parts, with each of the different points of view being true of one of those parts. So we had seen in the Phaedo that we're like creatures living on the surface of the water, with one set of eyes looking up to one world and another set of eyes looking down to the other world. So Plato thought that there are really two worlds. The world we perceive with our mind is the world of forms, and Heraclitus was completely correct about that it was permanent, unchanging, and completely unified within the form of the good. And he thought that Heraclitus was completely true about the world that we perceive with our senses, that it was constantly changing and shifting back and forth between an irreducible opposition of contrary properties or opposites. So literally, the world that we think of with our mind and the world that we see with our eyes are two different worlds for Plato. And that should obviously make the solution to the problem of happiness easy as well, because once we see that there are permanent things that are self-same and pure and unchanging, if we could latch ourselves to those, develop the part of our soul that is in contact with those things, or that has affinity for those things, as he said in the argument from affinity in the Phaedo, then we will become like the forms themselves, unchanging, pure, and permanent, and gain a type of happiness that is no longer subject to change or subject to time. So we're going to organize our discussion of the forms around this list of 6 different properties of the forms. You'll see the first 2 properties of the forms sort of say just what a form is. And we'll see they're introduced in Plato's argument from Recollection, from the Phaedo. The second 2 properties of the forms, that the forms are archetypes, or the perfect models of all things, and that they're ultimately real, the ultimate source of all the reality we find in this world, are both illustrated in the allegory of the cave, that's from the Republic. They're both saying in different ways, we'll see, that the relationship between forms and material objects is exactly the same as the relationship between a shadow and the object that casts that shadow, with the forms being the real object, and the shadows being the objects that we perceive in this material world. And the last 2 properties, the saying that the forms are causes of all things in 2 different ways, and that they're systematically interconnected, are also explained by some allegories or metaphors from the Republic. We'll see that the sun metaphor explains the 2 ways in which the causes of all are the causes of all things, and the divided line explains how the forms are systematically interconnected into a dialectical system. And we'll see that both of those are explained by the story that Plato tells in his late dialogue that we don't read, called the Timaeus, where he gives an account of how the universe was created. So let's look at the first 2 properties of the forms and the argument from Recollection, or the argument from mathematics first. Sometimes the argument from Recollection is called the argument from mathematics because Plato preferred to use examples of mathematical concepts as examples of the abstract ideas from which this argument begins. So the common ground of this argument is that we have abstract ideas that apply universally, that is, that apply beyond the particular cases that we've seen. You have an idea of dog, and it doesn't just apply to the particular dogs that you've seen. It applies beyond them to even dogs that you haven't seen, or perhaps even dogs that haven't existed yet, new breeds of dogs. Plato's argument is going to be that there's no way that we could ever have possibly gotten ideas that go beyond experience through the senses. The senses only give us images or visible pictures of the particular cases that we've seen. If we were a computer recording objects on our webcam and storing pictures, when we searched our database for the pictures of dogs that we've seen so far, a new dog that we hadn't seen before would come up as negative. It wouldn't be categorized as a dog because it didn't match anything in our database of actual experiences. So since we are able to form general ideas, like the idea of dog, in a way that goes beyond our particular set of memories of actual visible images, it's obvious that our mind couldn't be functioning the way a computer does, simply by storing sense images. So Plato's going to say that our ideas are not sense images, they don't come from visible things like the images we get from our senses, which are like pictures taken in a camera. Instead, they must be ideas in our mind that refer to something beyond this world. So the argument from Recollection is an argument from the Phaedo for the immortality of the soul, that therefore we must have lived before we were born because we have these perfect mathematical ideas, and there are no perfect mathematical objects like points and lines and triangles in this world. Hence, we must be remembering those ideas from another world in order to explain the universal and necessary character of that knowledge. The argument for the immortality is not as important for us, but this is how Plato introduces his theory of forms, by pointing out that we have abstract ideas. In fact, the heart of our intelligence is a type of ability to recognize, literally to remember, cases that we haven't seen before. When we see a new type of dog and we recognize it as a dog, we're recognizing it as related to some abstract idea, and that abstract idea couldn't possibly have come merely from cases in this world, or wouldn't apply universally beyond the cases we've actually seen to new ones. So Plato recognized that these forms are like the abstraction of one property out of the complex combination of properties that exist in a real object. And this is why we couldn't have gotten them from this world. The word eidos means outline, or literally the form or the silhouette of an object. And note that that leaves out most of the details of that object and abstracts out only its outline, only its abstract shape. The forms are in the same way just one property. The form of a dog is just dogness. It isn't a big dog, a little dog, a brown dog, a white dog, a German Shepherd, or a beagle. It's just dogness by itself and just that abstract property. So the fact that we have ideas of a perfect circle or a perfect triangle is impossible to explain if all we see are the objects in this world, because there are no perfect circles or perfect triangles in this world. So the fact that we have them must mean that we're remembering them, according to Plato, from some previous existence in which we had contact with these types of abstract entities. So a form, first of all, is pure. It's only one property. The form of whiteness is not a white piece of paper or a white triangle or a white piece of wood. It's just plain old whiteness, and it applies, therefore, to all white things, even ones that don't exist yet, even ones we haven't seen, and even all the various different types of material objects made out of wood, plastic, or paper that might be white. The second property of the forms is that they are outside of space and time. We've already seen that they're what Plato would call invisible, in that they're not merely sensory images. They're abstract qualities that are really only perceived intelligibly by our mind and not really by our senses. And that means that they're outside of space and time. A particular object, like the computer screen or the phone screen that you're looking at, is only existing in one place. It has a location in one place and a limited existence in time. But the form of redness would exist wherever a red object were. And in fact, it's not even correct to say that the form of redness exists in many places, because really it doesn't exist in any place at all, because even if all the red objects in the world were destroyed, the form of redness, the property of redness as a possibility for being, would still exist. Even if all of the triangles in the world were destroyed, I could sit in my closet at night when no one was looking and make little paper triangles. That reality, the new triangularity I've made, doesn't float into existence from nowhere, just as my knowledge of them doesn't float into existence from nowhere. Plato thinks the forms exist outside of space and time. They're immune to change. Dinosaurs may go in and out of existence, but the property of being a dinosaur has always existed as an eternal possibility for being. And Plato thinks that it's impossible for us to have ever gotten those universals from any set of particulars. The Gavagai problem, which is based upon a famous argument by the 20th century philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, was an illustration of that. You can't get your idea of rabbit from somebody just pointing to something and saying rabbit, or in this case, the term for rabbit was Gavagai, because you wouldn't know which of the properties that that complex object had was really the one that they meant by rabbit. Was it two-eared thing, or furry thing, or hoppy thing, or mammal, or warm-blooded, or living thing, or maybe just food? That's the problem, is that it's impossible to explain how human beings intelligently recognize the relevant properties of an object. Plato thinks unless we already have contact with pure properties, which only refer to one property and can't be mixed up with a bunch of other properties like furry or warm-blooded or hoppy or food-bearing. So the forms are primarily transcendent and pure. They're immune from change, existing outside of space and time, and they're only one property. This should remind you of how Plato's going to solve the problem of happiness, because the very fact that the forms are permanent, self-same, and pure means if we could attach ourselves to those things, we'd have a type of happiness that was permanent, immune from change and death, and was pure itself, self-same, immune from contradictions or tensions. The cave metaphor is going to explain the next two properties of the forms, that the forms are archetypes. Just in the same way, the shadows that you see on the wall, all of their properties are imperfect due to the imperfections of the cave wall, but the perfect examples of those properties are the real things that are casting those shadows. To say the forms are ultimately real is to say something very similar. It's to say that all of the reality I see here, this curve and this shape, the circularity of this ring, all of them are borrowed from the reality of this object. And that's true of all images. If you watch television, anything that you notice on the television isn't there in the actual object any more than the reality of these shadows is on the irregular wall of the cave. Instead, it's being somehow transmitted into them by some process. In the cave, it's the process of shadow and casting shadow, of light and blockage of light. In a TV screen, it's the electronic process of transmitting an image through the cable and through frequencies that are reproduced on the pixels of your TV screen. But to say that the forms are ultimately real is to say everything you can see, every form, every reality, everything that you find interesting, everything that you might desire, is not coming from the wall, but is being transmitted into it by these other objects, which contain all of that reality. They're the really real things. The shadows on the wall are just copies. In the same way, the forms, these abstract qualities, are the really real things. Material objects only borrow their reality from the thing that's causing this image, that's causing this shadow. To say that the forms are archetypes is to say that they're the perfect models of reality that are casting the shadows, and that those models of reality are actually have the properties that they're casting. The form of redness is red. The form of humanity is a man. The form of dogness is a dog. But they are the perfect examples of dogness. And the dogs that we see are imperfect, and borrow all of their reality from the things that's casting the shadow. Things in this world, of course, will be imperfect because they're not just the form of dogness. They have other material properties that get in the way of the perfect expression of their dogness, in the same way that the imperfection of the cave wall prevents the perfect expression of the shapes of the objects that are casting those shadows. So this has important implications for happiness as well. Whenever you desire something, if you were in the cave, if you desired one of the objects on the wall, it would draw you toward the wall. You would think you desired the image, just like a dog will sometimes think that the cat that it sees or the food that it sees on TV is there inside the television screen. But they've made a mistake because those aren't the really ultimately real things. All the reality of those objects is flowing into them by the objects that are casting those shadows. So what you really desire when you desire something on the cave wall is not the shadows on the wall. You desire the object that's casting those shadows. So Plato thinks whenever you desire anything in this world, whenever you love it, whenever you fall in love, you're not really desiring this particular thing. It's just an image. It's just a TV show. What you desire is the reality that the TV show is flowing to you from. What you desire are the objects that are casting those shadows. So, in some sense, Plato thinks that the cave metaphor is literally true. He thinks that our brain is like a virtual reality machine. We'll call this the mind's eye model. This is the basis of Plato's argument from the senses, or argument from objectivity for the forms. He thinks that just as when the people in the cave aren't seeing the real thing, they're seeing an image that's been generated from the ultimately real thing, from the archetypes. So Plato thinks literally when you see something, when you see, say, a wooden triangle, you don't actually see the actual triangle. It's not like the triangle flows into your soul. Instead, light bounces off the triangle, causes change in your eye, on your retina. That sends a signal up to your brain, and then your brain is like a virtual reality machine. It produces an image. You don't actually see the real triangle. Instead, you see a sense image that your brain produces in a virtual reality, and you don't see it with your physical eye. Instead, you see it with your mind's eye, with your soul that's in there doing the watching, like the people in the cave. So literally, your soul or your mind is trapped inside this cave, trapped inside this virtual reality, which is produced by your brain on the basis of the inputs from those material objects. So let's see how this would work in relationship to the creation of the world. This is going to help explain the fifth and the sixth properties of the forms, how the forms are the causes of all things, and how the forms are systematically interconnected. But this also explains how the forms are archetypes and how they're ultimately real as well. In the Timaeus, Plato says that in the beginning there only existed one form, the form of the good, or the Parmenidean one. And apart from that, there existed only this primordial ooze, or this primordial clay, this chaotic matter. You can imagine it like the snow on your TV screen before there's a signal on it. There's no form or shape in which you would actually be able to identify an object or a reality. So the first thing that the form of the good is going to have to do in order to create reality is to make copies of itself, to make other molds or forms that it can apply to this chaotic clay or matter. The principle of plenitude was sort of the principle of a different type of love that Plato said existed. We had talked about this when we talked about the divine masculine, the overflowing of the form of the good, the overflowing of the one down into the copies of itself that it made through the process of emanation. So the story in the Timaeus was the basis of the Neoplatonic idea of emanation, or everything flowing down and breaking off from the one. So you can think of it as a process of successive copying. So the one, or God, would sort of stick his head in the copy machine and make a copy of just his head. He would stick, maybe his rear end in the copy machine and make another copy of just his rear end. You'd have two different copies of the same thing, but those realities would be different aspects or different partial grasp of the one giant form which was in the original. And then that form would overflow into making copies of itself. So when the first copies came out of the copy machine, then you'd stick those copies back in the machine and make copies of the one true thing. And each of those copies would only capture one partial aspect of the original copy. And then you could make copies of those copies of those copies, and copies of those copies of those copies of those copies of the one original thing. And you can see that if the world were created by this process of breaking off or successive copying, like the story we had told earlier of the ocean that got split up into separate drops, separate individual beings from their wholeness, you can see that structure is just like dialectic, except it's dialectic in reverse. We had been talking about dialectic in the upwards direction, where you take two subjective points of view and transcend them by a synthesis, and then take those two subjective points of view and transcend them in another synthesis, like the two little drops merging to a bigger drop, and then merging with other drops to make a bigger drop, until eventually all the drops merge back into the one big thing, or the one big ocean of being. So now the Timaeus is telling us that that's how the world really came into existence, by this principle of overflowing or copying. Another way to see it, if you like, is to imagine that there's one giant light set in this auditorium, and the light is so full and so brilliant that it casts reflections of itself. It tries to find every little dark corner and dark place in the entire gymnasium to light up in some way. There will be imagine there's two big mirrors which will reflect some portion of that light, and they reflect that light into two other mirrors, and they reflect that light into other mirrors. This will explain why Plato calls the chief form the form of the good, because it's sort of the one form that all things share in common. It's the one sort of great father from which all things flow. So it's the form of everything, just like the form of red is the form that all red things share in common. The form of the good is what all reality shares in common. And to say that it's the form of goodness is to say it's the ultimate object of desire, that whenever you want to desire something, what you want is not the image down here that you're seeing on the TV screen. What you want is the ultimate source of that image as it exists in the world of forms in its full plenitude. So Plato thought that everything, insofar as it existed, would be good. And why would there be bad things? Why would there be a little tiny mirror hidden under the stands in our auditorium that only had a very, very dim copy on it? Insofar as that thing exists, it has light on it, and it's a copy of the good, but it's a very faint copy of the good. It's a process of the reflection of and diminution by many levels of copying. But Plato says that God would have been jealous if he would have held back any portion of his light from any of the dark corners of reality. So Plato thinks that evil is just an absence of good, an absence of light that comes from the diminution that comes from this copying process, but that it's a measure of God's plenitude or goodness, that it fills even the dark, empty corners. Even though the dark, empty corners that it fills then result in objects we would call evil, like ticks or bacteria or the HIV virus. So a good way of thinking of this, and this should remind you of the one and the many, is imagine that the form of the good is like a cube that's making different impressions of itself in the sand. You could press the cube into the sand with one face and it would make a square. if you pressed a corner of the cube into the sand, it might make a little triangle. If you pressed just the tip of the corner in, it would make just a point. You can put one edge in, and it would make a line. If you stuck that edge in and then you twirled it around, you would get a circle if you moved the edge of that around in a circle. If you took the square and stuck it in the sand and made a square and then dragged the cube along, it would make a stretched out square or a rectangle. So all the various and different shapes that you can see in the sand all in some way come from or are copies of the cube. And by that explains how the forms are causes of all things, or how the forms are ultimately real, and that every form, every outline, remember that's the basic meaning of eidos or forms, the silhouette, every shape or form or outline that you see here ultimately came from the cube, either by setting its edge there or twirling its edge around, or just pointing and making a triangle by sticking one corner in. No matter how we're making all these weird shapes that may not look like they're all copies of the cube, every form and every line owes itself to that one original cube. So that's what's true of the form of the good. Everything that's real, everything that you can see, every form, shape, or structure that you can see is a different partial expression, a partial image of that one form of the good, according to Plato. So hopefully you've recognized that diagram that comes from the Timaeus that you're seeing here on the screen is the systematic interconnectedness of the forms, and that's what's described in the divided line in the Republic. The divided line has four big divisions. The first division is the higher forms that are very abstract, like maybe just shape or moral structure. Those would be the first copies of this abstract form of the good. Then you'd make copies of shape into like squares and rectangles, and you'd make copies of those into long rectangles and flat rectangles and all the different types of rectangles. Then you would make, just as Plato said in the Timaeus, after the form of the good made all of the other molds, all of the other forms, it would then take them and apply them to the primordial clay or the primordial matter. And then you'd get a very different type of object. So this would be like the form of chair, and these would be all of the different particular chairs. And note that here the diagram starts to be inaccurate, because a form of chairness, remember, is impure. So it would be not only a copy of the form of chair, but also a copy of the form of metal or the form of furniture or all kinds of other forms. Of course, that would make our diagram unintelligible when you saw all of the different forms involved in a real chair. And when we get to the bottom, we see that sense images are a copy of the chair that's produced in our mind. If we have two eyes, there'll be two different copies or two different images of the chair, which is itself a copy of the form of chairness, which is itself a copy of the form of furnitureness, which is itself a copy of the form of shape, which is a copy of the form of the good. But the major divisions are the higher forms, the lower forms, material objects, and sense images. And those are the four different regions of the divided line. And Plato saw that the world of objects and material things is radically different from the world of forms. These are all impure appearances. This is why he also says that this region of the divided line, these things down here, are material objects which are impure. We can never get any real knowledge of them. We can only have subjective opinion, which might always disagree, which is the basis of Plato's argument from relativism, that there's no way we could get truth from these objects. The upper levels, these levels of the forms and the higher forms, are the objects about which we can have knowledge, because they're transcendent and pure, unchanging, and only one property. So when you get one of those into your head, everybody will see it exactly the same way and come to the same truth. But the divided line represents the systematic interconnectedness of the forms, and now you should recognize that the systematic interconnectedness of the forms is nothing but dialectic. We had seen before that Plato's view of reality was that all of reality was dialectic, not just in the sense that it combined the world of Parmenides and the world of Heraclitus, but that the very structure of reality is this genealogy, this family tree that showed how reality descended from the form of the good into different copies of itself, and how we, working our way back up, use the dialectic to try to resynthesize our knowledge and ourself to regain the wholeness that we once had. And that explains the two ways in which the forms are the causes of all things. We've talked about this before as the divine masculine and the divine feminine, but now this should show you with more rigor what exactly we mean by those two different directions to creation. There's the way it actually happened, the order of being on the left. The way down is how everything branched off from the form of the good through this process of emanation, or this process of copying. The order of knowledge, on the other hand, is the way back up, the way in which we try to retrace our steps. But Plato is going to point out something important for you to recognize about that way up and about the nature of dialectic, which perhaps you might not have grasped so much. And that's why the second way, the order of knowledge, is also called the way of illumination, or the doctrine of illumination, because it's going to be dependent upon the way down. Even though we're working our way back up, the only reason we can work our way back up is because we're remembering that we were once up this ladder, we were once whole, and the only thing that allows us to recapture that wholeness is the fact that we're remembering or feeling the illumination that kindles our memory and allows us to reactivate the part of ourselves that was already up there in the first place, that was eternally part of the whole, or the one, or the form of the good. So the sun metaphor, or the doctrine of illumination, explains the two ways that the forms are the causes of all things. So the sun is the cause of everything in two different ways too, and he's using the sun here to illustrate how the form of the good works, or God in Aristotle or Neoplatonism. The sun is the source, in the order of being, is the source of the life of all living things, because all of the energy of all living things comes from that same one source. The plants grow from the light from the sun, then animals eat the plants and get all of their energy from the plants, and then other animals will eat those animals. But all of the energy of every living thing, no matter what it eats, originally comes from the energy that plants derive from the sun. That's similar to the order of being, the way down in our dialectic structure. All of the reality of everything that exists is borrowed from the form of the good. So every bit of form or order that allows things to exist is flowing down from the form of the good. Everything else is just a copy of that. Remember, the things that we see are not the ultimate realities. Every form or structure we find in them is borrowed from the thing that's really casting the image that we see down here on the TV screen. That's the first way in which the forms are causes of things, in the order of being. The second way is symbolized by the way in which light is the cause of visibility. And this is the part that corresponds to the doctrine of recollection, as the confusing part. Because even though this refers to the way back up, the arrow up, what we call the divine feminine, where we retrace our steps and regain wholeness and move from thesis to antithesis to synthesis, Plato's going to hold that the cause of that movement back up is not our action at the bottom. It is the light that's illuminating those particulars from the form of the good. In the same way that when we see something, we can see that the visibility of that object isn't just coming from the object. If I look at my hand and then I close all the lights so it's pitch black, my hand will still be there, but I'll no longer see it. The cause of the visibility of my hand doesn't lie in my hand, it lies in the light that's shining down from above. So in the same way, the doctrine of recollection says that what makes me recognize my hand, what makes me enable to transcend the thesis and the antithesis to get to the synthesis, is not just the sense images, is not the thing that I see in this world. Remember, no matter how many dogs I saw, I'd never get an abstract idea of dog, because the idea of dog covers more dogs and allows me to recognize more dogs than I could ever possibly see with my senses. So Plato thought the idea of dog is a recollection of my knowledge from a previous life of some abstract quality or form that exists beyond this world. So that really, even though it looks like I'm putting together thesis and antithesis to get to synthesis, now we see that that's incorrect. That thesis and antithesis merely remind me of knowledge that I already have, that's flowing down in the doctrine of illumination. And that had I not been already part of the form of that thing, I would never be able to make the jump from those two cases of thesis and antithesis to the synthesis in the form or knowledge or recognition of the form of that thing. So even though the way back up looks like dialectic is putting together subjective images to build an objective image, that's not how it happens at all. You already were there at the top, and what the subjective images do is remind you and allow you to reconnect with that objective part of you that was always there, by the recollection that's stimulated by the light, or stimulated by the flow of intelligibility down from God. They've said this is similar to the doctrine of grace in Christianity, in the same way that many Protestant religions would hold that you are not the source of your good actions, that by yourself you'd be inherently sinful. It's only God's grace flowing down into you that allows you to reclaim your goodness. So in the same way, Plato's doctrine of recollection says that our knowledge never comes from sense objects, just like what we're desiring when we watch TV is never TV. Our knowledge comes from the form that's flowing down from the form of the good, like light, in the same way that our real desire is for the objects that are flowing into the TV screen. So this may help you understand some of the arguments we've talked about why Plato thinks there is this other reality. As long as we're talking about the cave metaphor, it's useful to see how the cave metaphor can be used as an objection or an alternative explanation of the three most common grounds that people might use to argue against Plato. So these are three bad arguments, three common grounds that Plato can answer quite easily by using the virtual reality metaphor, the cave metaphor, as an alternative explanation. The first argument that this world is real is that we can't see the forms when the person goes back into the cave and they say that there's a whole other world out there outside of the cave. Of course, the people in the cave are never going to be able to see that world unless they leave the cave. In fact, they wouldn't even be able to see the person next to them talking to them. In the movie The Matrix, in order to talk to the people in the virtual reality, you have to enter the virtual reality. You have to enter the video game. And from within the video game, you can't show them the reality of the things outside them. But of course, that doesn't prove the fact that we can't see this alternative reality doesn't mean that it's not real and that this is the real world. Plato's alternative explanation is that if we were in the Matrix, or we were stuck in a video game, we wouldn't be able to see the world outside the video game, but the video game would still be unreal. If we were stuck watching a TV show, we wouldn't be able to see the world outside the TV show, but that would be because we were trapped inside this virtual reality. The same idea can be used to answer the second argument, that material objects feel like they're real because they feel like they have causality. It may feel like I can take the little finger you see moving around here and press the button and cause it to do things in the video. This is often called the user illusion in computer science because we recognize that this arrow that you see on the screen is not really causing anything. It's just a bunch of pixels on your screen. Any causality it has is borrowed from the thing that's causing it, from the computer that's causing the screen, and ultimately from my hand that's moving it around on the mouse. So the people in the cave might say, well, what do you mean these things aren't real? They have causality. Look, with this shadow bat, I can hit this shadow ball and knock it over the fence in a game of cave baseball. But it should be obvious that the causality that the things in that world appear to have are not really in those objects, in the shadows, but in the objects that are casting the shadows. So the fact that objects in this world have a type of causality, I can take a hammer and bust open a rock, for example, doesn't prove that the hammer and the rock are real, because even in the Matrix, the hammer and the rock would appear to have causality, but all the causality would be coming from the computer that was generating the virtual reality. Just like it may seem like Mario's hammer has reality in the Mario Brothers video game when he knocks over barrels with it. But it should be equally obvious that that has another explanation. It's coming from the computer program that's running the game, and it's coming from the person who's moving the joystick. So the fact that objects have causality doesn't mean they're real. The last bad argument, may be even more convincing to you, though. We think that objects in this world are real because they can hurt us. If you don't think, a brick is real, if we hit you over the head and you're bleeding from being hit with it, then you'll think it's real. If you don't eat, you'll die. If we don't allow our bodies to have sexual relations, we won't be able to reproduce, and the species will go extinct. So it's hard to say that you can't believe that these objects are real. Yet note that Plato's answer, again, is to say that there's another explanation of why I think these things are real. Because I would still think they were real if I were trapped in the Matrix. I would think that they were real because you could hurt my little character in the video game, but it wouldn't be hurting the real me. Within the video game, I would think they were real. I would think I was dying. I would think that they could harm me. But Plato thinks we're not only mistaken about the reality of this world, we're also mistaken about where we are. The people in the cave, if you ask them to point to themselves, wouldn't point to their real self. They'd point to the shadow on the wall. If you're in a video game and you're really into it and somebody asks, where are you? You might say, I'm here on the 3rd level. You'd be making the same mistake. And because the video game can kill your character, doesn't mean that it's real, because it hasn't killed the real you. You still exist outside the video game. And Plato thinks that it's actually really kind of true. Just like in a video game, you can hit reset and play the game again. So Plato, remember, thought that the character that you're in now, your particular identity, is just a character, and when you die, you won't cease to exist. He thinks that the game will be reset, the virtual reality will be reset, and you'll be reincarnated, and you'll get to try again until you finally practice dying to where you could leave the video game. So the cave metaphor and the basic idea of how the forms are the ultimately real things and how the forms are the causes of all things should also demonstrate to you that these basic arguments against Plato's theory don't work, at least in this form, because Plato can use the cave metaphor as an alternative explanation. Even if you weren't in the real world, if you were in the Matrix, it would still be true that you couldn't see the world outside the Matrix. Things in the Matrix would seem to have causality, and it would seem that things in the Matrix could hurt you. But this wouldn't mean that they were real. The other explanation is you're in a virtual reality, and all the causality and all the harm that is going on in this world is happening to your character, and all the reality is really borrowed reality, coming from the ultimately real things, which are the forms. So hopefully that'll give you an idea of how to think about Plato's theory of forms in your essays.